Welcome to Lesson 11, Early Language Development through Listening, Speaking, Viewing, and Visually Representing. This is the slide that suggests several strategies for you to use to maximize your learning. Be sure that you access the interviews and the sources that are mentioned within the slides and look at those several times in order to learn the material. Remember, these are instead of having a textbook, so they are something that you are going to want to use as a reference. Lesson objectives for this series of lessons. You will be comparing the differences among young children's family backgrounds related to the amount of talking done by the parents. And by young children, we mean birth to age 3. You're also going to relate the amount of talking in a child's background to future reading success. You will identify the importance of the visual arts and music to language development. You will determine the scope and sequence of visual arts and music taught from grades K through 8. Some of the experts, the ones on the early childhood language development, are Betty Hart and Todd Risley, and Rebecca Silverman has information related to the use of the visual arts. So these are people that you especially will want to remember as you go through your program. Some points to ponder before you go forward in the series of slides would be, why do you think early oral language exposure is related to future reading success? Consider all the types of oral communication that are possible between parent and child. And what do you think is the role of the arts, visual and music, in literacy development? Betty Hart and Todd Risley are known for their research on early childhood language acquisition. And although their studies were conducted a good 20 years ago or so, they are landmark studies and still cited in all the recent research on language development among young children. There is a wonderful interview that I've given you the link to go to. It's an interview with Dr. Todd Risley. And this is something that you'll be able to hear his words. You can also read the interview. What Works Clearinghouse has it both in oral and in written form. Unfortunately, about 2 years ago, Dr. Risley died. He lived in Alaska. He was probably in his 60s. He died an untimely death, and I believe it was a heart attack. Anyway, Hart and Risley had used interventions with children who came from low socioeconomic backgrounds to promote oral language usage. They noted that these children came to a daycare center in Kansas City and they were not able to use a lot of words in speech, and nor were they able to know the meaning of a lot of words that they heard in reading and in speech. And so they tried to help them learn words through the use of intensive interventions. They found that the children, after these interventions were used, talked more, but they continued to add words more slowly than the professor's children, who were also part of this daycare environment. And so they realized that using interventions with children older than 3 was getting at them a little bit too late. They wanted to know what was going on in the home before the children got to school, that set up this vocabulary gap between the two groups of children from low and high SES groups. And this wondering about that, trying to fix it through interventions, led to their landmark study to determine the differences that existed in the homes of the children. They wanted to learn basically how children learn to talk. Hart and Risley wrote up an account of their research that they did in the homes in a book called Meaningful Differences. And it is a very excellent book to read and to get a sense as to their research and what they found. They conducted an observational study on what went on in the homes that promoted language development. They went into 42 homes and they were divided among low, middle, and high SES groups. Observers were trained and visited 1 hour a month for 36 months, and they followed the child and tape recorded every instance of language spoken to or around the child. They also recorded nonverbal communication such as gestures and facial expressions. And from this, they found that there were basically two types of parents: taciturn, meaning rather quiet, keeping to themselves, and talkative parents. Hart and Risley counted the data starting at age 9 months and ending at the child's 3rd birthday, which would be 36 months. And here are some of their important discoveries. First, there were wide variations in the amount of talking that the parents were doing in the home. Second, the purpose for talking varied, and they divided this into business talk, where parents would say things such as, "Stop that," "Sit down." The amount was consistent among SES groups. All parents did business talk at about the same level. The other type of talk was elaborations, where parents would elaborate on things. If a child brought them a truck, the parent would say, "Look at that big red truck that you have. Look at the 4 wheels that it has on it," and so on and so forth, where they elaborated on something, or where a child would say something and a parent would repeat it and then add words to it. And the elaborations did vary among the socioeconomic groups, with the most elaborations occurring among those professors' children, the high SES groups, and the lowest number of elaborations occurred in the low SES groups. The third thing that they discovered was the amount of parent talk was related to the child's vocabulary size, regardless of the socioeconomic level. Through their research, Hart and Risley discovered that taciturn parents engaged mostly in business talk and spoke fewer words to their children. Talkative parents engaged more in elaborations. What if? Remember. Number of words heard by children in the high SES homes were 2,100 words per hour, and in the low SES homes they heard 600 words per hour. 80% of the variation in public school performance relates to family, not school effects. Interesting fact. The family has a powerful, powerful effect on children. And part of your job as a teacher may be to reach out to the families and draw them in more. I know from personal experience that I got so busy teaching the children that it was hard to remember that the family is the one with all the power here, and to include them in a more meaningful way in the classroom. That's just my personal experience. You can think about your own. Children's positive experiences with language come out of non-business conversations. And that means not so much being told what to do, like it's time to go to bed, brush your teeth, but their positive experiences with language come from the elaborations, from conversations, from playing with words, from playing with sentences, and hearing stories, oral stories, hearing nursery rhymes. Those are what create positive experiences for the children. Talkative parents now we're talking about affirmations, meaning reaffirming things that the child did well, and prohibitions, things that the child should not be doing. All right, so talkative parents had 750,000 affirmations and 120,000 prohibitions to their child by age 4. So this research on affirmations and prohibitions continued until age 4. Taciturn parents had 120,000 affirmations. Look at the difference between taciturn and talkative. And yet look at the difference here on prohibitions, 250,000. So when the taciturn parents did speak, it was to direct their child. Interesting. So how does all of this affect you, the teacher in the classroom? You can't really go into the home and direct parents to talk to their children. Although, as I said, you can draw the family more into the classroom and perhaps make some impact that way. But by and large, what goes on in the home is something way out of your control. And yet, oral language proficiency predicts reading success. So reading depends on children having a strong oral language background. By the time a child is 3, there is no way to help a child with taciturn parents catch up in the number of words heard and therefore the number of words learned, or at least known in that receptive vocabulary. There's no way they can catch up to the children with talkative parents. And so the fact that you can't catch these children up, though, doesn't mean that you can't teach them language. It's just they're going to learn language at a slower rate. And if they never catch up, well, in their own right, they're going to be able to perform in school if you, the teacher, works on providing a word-rich environment. Now, here are some considerations also. More and more children are enrolled in daycare, starting as infants. There are older children now who are beyond that threshold of age 3, and what are some considerations about them? And currently, right now, a lot of organizations, a lot of groups, a lot of schools, Department of Education at the federal level are spending a lot of money on intervention programs trying to help children learn to read. What they're doing is they're compensating for the early low vocabulary exposure that occurred in the homes. Could this money be better spent? Could the federal government or the state government or charitable organizations who donate money, foundations, could perhaps they should be looking toward the home more than in the classroom? I'm not suggesting that that's true, but that's certainly food for thought. All right, continuing with the research of Dr. Risley and Dr. Hart. Infants and young children need positive emotional relationships and interactions with parents and caregivers. Again, that's pretty much out of your control, what you're doing, but as you draw parents in on parent nights and have them be a vital part of your classroom, perhaps you can relay some of this information to them and let them know when you see them hugging their child and talking to their child how important that is to the child. The focus should be on chattiness, talking, thinking aloud, and commenting on what the child is doing. It doesn't require training. It doesn't require money. It just requires parents to be aware that when they chat to their children, when they talk to their children, when they comment on what they're doing, when they elaborate, they're actually helping them build those early reading foundational skills. Birth through age 3 plus vocabulary comes strictly from what the children hear. At this point, they are unable, most are unable to read books and get vocabulary that way. So it's all auditory at this point. We have concluded the interview by Todd Risley, and I know you're going to enjoy it. I have it both in the written form, and of course I have access to the oral. And their research is fascinating and has certainly shed a lot of light on why some of these learning gaps are difficult to close. Now, even though they're difficult to close, and even though some children may never catch up to other children, all children can learn, And with good instruction, remember it comes down to the teacher more than the method. With the teacher, they can learn enough in order to be productive citizens, to be successful in school. And yes, at the very end of everything, we will have those students who have gone on to be the rocket scientists, and we will have other students who go on to be wonderful workers at other jobs. And so we shouldn't worry about catching them up so everybody's equal, but instead of maximizing the learning that is possible for each child. Now, this is a podcast that I've given you a link to by Dr. Rebecca Silverman. It's a 13-minute, 49-second podcast, and some of the high points from that are written as bullets on these PowerPoints. She says that differences exist in the level of vocabulary knowledge in young children. So she is certainly paralleling her research, or what she knows about children is virtually the same as the Hart and Risley research. She says the most pronounced differences in academic vocabulary, and by academic vocabulary we mean those words that you're going to find specific to academic content areas, and also very sophisticated words that don't arise all that naturally in everyday speech, such as negotiate, such as cooperate, although cooperate you could sort of argue may be more of an everyday word now. This is problematic. These differences are problematic because vocabulary predicts later literacy achievement. So you're hearing the same thing but from a different researcher. Now, some strategies that she recommends that teachers use to help children learn words such as negotiate, or photosynthesis. I'll throw one in there that's content related. You should define the words in kid-friendly language. And I believe I mentioned in one of the earlier lesson segments that before you define words for children, even if you think you know the meaning, look it up, because defining words is not easy. You want to define them in few words. You want to define them clearly. And it's best not to give a lot of examples. You can give one or two, but sometimes definitions I have heard are comprised of examples, and I'm still left wondering what the word means itself. So make sure that you have a clear idea of the definition of the word, even write it down. That will enable you then to reword it in kid-friendly language. Use words in context. Choose words the kids need. Use word study, and differentiate instruction. And when you hear her podcast, she will go into more detail. All right, here's some points to ponder based on Rebecca Silverman's podcast. What are some ways to differentiate vocabulary instruction for the children in your class? And how can you use visual arts and music to differentiate vocabulary instruction? Now let's try and pull together what you know about vocabulary learning and what you know from Rebecca Silverman, and think about the Common Core state standards related to speaking and listening. These are standards for grades K through 5. If you're teaching older students, you can also check the Common Core standards for older students, but a lot of these can easily be ratcheted up to accommodate the older students. Also, if you have students who need enriching, you can also take these standards and make them more difficult, or more rich, I should say, for those students. And I've provided the website for you for the Common Core standards. Now, goal for K2 is comprehension and collaboration. So when you're trying to get your students to speak and listen, you want them to understand what's going on in listening, and in speaking you want to collaborate. You want to have a shared discussion with other students. A goal of kindergarten is the presentation of knowledge and ideas. And so there's a progression of complexity that you may want to think about as far as the developmental stages that you want to take your students through. to develop speaking and listening skills? And how can you implement these standards in the classroom? All right, we're moving on now into core knowledge related to visual arts and music. And the website to access that, to read this in its entirety, is posted for you. Some of the high points from it are the arts are an essential part of learning. This enables children to receive and communicate ideas through their art. And if you picture children in a little kindergarten class, in a first grade class, where they're at the painting easel, or they've made something out of clay, or they've drawn a picture, they are definitely wanting to communicate their ideas and tell you what they have created. There are two types of comprehension, and we've mentioned these earlier in some of the other lesson segments, but basically it's receptive, where children are listening, they are viewing, and they are reading. They are receiving information. All right, now to use that comprehension of ideas, the use of it is expressive, where they are speaking and other people are comprehending. So you have to organize your speaking in such a way that it's easily comprehensible to others. You can use visual representation, visually representing your ideas. For example, I have provided the PowerPoints to help you follow along with my oral presentation on the content of this course. And of course, it can be through writing as well. And so the two types of comprehension are receptive and expressive. Continuing with the core knowledge visual arts for grades K through 8. Appropriate visual art topics may be linked to content areas, and by other content areas other than the arts. And I'm asking you how, because this is something you will definitely want to consider as you work on your thematic integrated unit. How can you integrate art into math, into science, into social studies, and then of course more easily, we've done it so much in school, it's easily integrated into writing and expressing comprehension of reading. Now in kindergarten, they suggest the core knowledge visual arts has a developmental sequence. They suggest that students look at elements of art and talk about art. In grade 1, they study art from long ago. They too go back to elements of art, and they look at different kinds of pictures and still life. And in grade 2, they talk about elements of art. They look at sculpture, different kinds of pictures, including landscapes, abstract art, and architecture. Moving on, grades 3 through 5. In grade 3, notice how elements of art sort of cycles through there. They move into American Indian art, art of ancient Rome, and the Byzantine civilization. My goodness, what a wonderful integration of art and history. Grade 4, Art of the Middle Ages in Europe, Islamic art and architecture, the art of Africa, the art of China, the art of a new nation, and art of the United States. And actually, looking at that sequence again, the art of a new nation is the art of the United States. Grade 5, Art of the Renaissance, American art, 19th century, United States art, and art of Japan. And so you can see how the core knowledge visual arts really propels art to a new dimension, because so many times we consider, well, I can speak for myself, I considered art as painting or drawing pictures or making a diorama. But this moves it into a wonderful integration with cultures and with histories. And concluding this progression of art education, grade 6, art history, periods and schools. Then they start learning the different types of art, the classical, the Gothic, the Renaissance, the Baroque, the Rococo, the Neoclassical, the Romantic, and the Realism. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to name all these on a test, but it is good to notice for specific grade levels what it is that you could be doing with art in your classroom. Grade 7, art history, periods in schools, Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, Expressionism, and Abstraction, modern American paintings. And finally, grade 8, art history, periods in schools, painting since World War II, photography, 20th century sculpture, architecture since the Industrial Revolution. If students had this progression of art in their lessons integrated into other content areas, can you imagine the wealth of knowledge that they would possess? Here are some things that would be very helpful to you to get a sense of all the different parts of the curriculum that you could devote to art. Choose one grade level from K4 and one grade level from 5-8, and study the curriculum outline for each of the grades to determine themes that can be integrated with math, science, social studies, and the language arts. Now, this is something that would be very helpful for you as you're developing the thematic unit. List the themes and match to the grade level state frameworks, competencies, and objectives. And then I would go one more level. I would also match those to the core knowledge that we just covered and see whether you can integrate some of those elements and ideas that they are suggesting that students learn at each grade level. Moving from the visual arts into music, core knowledge also has a sequence of instruction for music in grades K through 8. And based on what you saw for the art, you can only imagine what this curriculum is going to look like and how rich it's going to be and how easy it would be to integrate it with other content areas. Starting with kindergarten, there are the elements of music, listening and understanding, and of course, songs. Grades 1 and 2, elements of music, listening and understanding, composers, orchestra instruments, stories told through music. I always think of Peter and the Wolf when I hear about that one, and American musical tradition and songs. Grades 3 and 4, elements of music, listening and understanding, all very similar to grades 1 and 2. It also includes musical connections. All right, moving along, grades 5 through 8, elements of music, listening and understanding, including composers and musical connections, American musical traditions, and songs. Grade 6, elements of music, classical music from Baroque to Romantic. Grade 7, elements of music, classical music, Romantics and Nationalists, American musical traditions. And grade 8, elements of music, non-Western music, classical music, nationalists and moderns, and vocal music. Now the reason, again, why I included visual arts and music in this segment with the Hart and Risley research on vocabulary acquisition is because through art and through music, students learn words. They can learn wonderful words, and they learn them in different ways. They don't get all of them from listening to speech and reading text, but they get them from different artworks, from looking at art, from creating art, from listening to music to creating music. And it's a way to help when we talk about differentiating instruction for students. A lot of students have talents in other areas, and it's a way to tap into their interests and their talents. And also, if it's planned well, to get them talking and using words that they need to know. The final slide on your series of lessons on vocabulary development is a slide on points to ponder. First of all, we'll think about points to ponder using visual arts for vocabulary development. Choose a grade level. Think about the content that you can teach through your grade level. From that content, what words could you teach? How can you promote viewing and reading? How can you promote speaking and writing through the visual arts. Thinking about music and vocabulary development, what words can you teach through music, through both listening to music and engaging, singing and writing music? How can you promote viewing and reading for music or with music? And how can you use music to promote speaking and writing? These are two content areas, music and visual arts, that are used a lot in the schools. And I think if we can just sort of tap them for academic content area learning and vocabulary learning, that we would get a lot more out of the time that the children are spending doing art and engaged in music.